The cold metal walls of the massive ship hummed with life for the first time in 200 years, and Captain Lee Dae-ho felt the familiar vibration through his bones as consciousness slowly returned to him. His eyes opened to dim blue light and the gentle hiss of the awakening chamber releasing its seal around his body, and he tried to move his fingers first, then his arms as the life support systems worked to bring him fully back from the deep sleep that had kept him alive while the galaxy forgot that humans had ever existed. Aria's voice filled the chamber with its calm, mechanical tone and spoke directly into his mind through the neural link that connected all senior officers to the ship's systems, and the AI said that detection protocols had been triggered by coalition mining vessels approaching the outer edge of what had once been the Sol system, where Earth had spun peacefully around its yellow star Lee. Dae-ho pushed himself up from the awakening chamber and felt his muscles protest after centuries of disuse, but the automated exercise systems had kept his body strong enough to function, and he stepped onto the cold deck plating that had been his home before the great sleep began. Around him, dozens of other chambers were opening with soft hissing sounds and releasing their occupants who had served as the skeleton crew of the Supercarrier Eternal Defiance during humanity's darkest hour when the Galactic Coalition had declared them too dangerous to exist. Admiral Park Soo-jin emerged from her chamber with the same steady composure she had shown when they had first entered the asteroid field to hide from Coalition forces, and her dark eyes met his with a question that needed no words, because they both understood that something had changed in the galaxy while they slept. Dr. Kim Tae-woo stumbled slightly as he left his chamber, but quickly regained his balance and immediately moved to the nearest console to check the ship's biological systems and the status of the 50,000 humans who remained in deep sleep throughout the massive vessel. Commander Yoon Bo-ra stretched her arms above her head, and Lee Dae-ho could see that she was already thinking about her fighters and whether they would still respond to her commands after so many years of waiting in the launch bays. Engineer Choi Min-ho moved past them all without speaking and headed directly to the main engineering console, where streams of data were already flowing across multiple screens showing the status of every system on the ship that had kept them alive and hidden while the galaxy moved on without knowing they existed. Aria's holographic form materialized in the center of the awakening chamber, and the AI's appearance had changed during their long sleep, because now she looked more human than before, with softer features and expressions that seemed almost alive. The AI began to speak, and her words carried news that none of them had expected to hear, because the Coalition mining ships were not just exploring the dead system, but were actively harvesting materials from the debris field that had once been Earth and its colonies. Admiral Park Soo-jin stepped forward and asked Aria to show them what had happened to their home system. During the 2 centuries they had been sleeping, and the holographic display that appeared above them showed a sight that filled them all with cold anger. Where Earth had once been, there was now nothing but scattered debris and mining platforms that pulled precious metals and rare elements from what remained of their homeworld, while Coalition ships moved back and forth carrying away everything that had once belonged to humanity. The display showed mining operations on Mars and the outer planets, and even the asteroid belt where they had hidden their ship was being slowly harvested by Coalition forces who had claimed the entire system as abandoned territory after declaring humanity extinct. Dr. Kim Tae-woo pulled up historical records that Aria had collected during their sleep, and the data showed that the galaxy had indeed moved on and forgotten about humans entirely, while the Coalition had expanded its control over thousands of star systems. The records showed that Coalition historians now taught that humans had been a primitive and violent species that had destroyed themselves through warfare and aggression before they could pose a threat to galactic civilization. Lee Dae-ho felt rage building inside him as he read reports that described human technology and achievements as crude attempts at civilization that had failed, because humans lacked the wisdom and patience needed for true advancement. But the most shocking discovery came when Dr. Kim Tae-woo accessed Coalition scientific databases and found that many of the technologies they claimed to have developed themselves were actually based on human innovations that had been captured during the Purge, the artificial intelligence. Systems that the Coalition used were built on human neural network designs, and their faster-than-light travel technology was an improved version of human quantum jump drives that had been reverse-engineered from captured ships. Even their medical advances were based on human genetic research that had been stolen from abandoned colonies and research stations after the Coalition forces had finished their systematic destruction of human civilization. Admiral Park Soo-jin studied the data with growing concern, because if the Coalition had built their current power on stolen human technology, then humans might have capabilities that could challenge their control of the galaxy. Arya confirmed this possibility when she revealed that the Eternal Defiance had not remained static during their long sleep, but had continued to develop and improve its systems using advanced automated research programs that had been running continuously for 200 years. The ship's weapons were now more powerful than anything the Coalition possessed, and its defensive systems could withstand attacks that would destroy entire Coalition fleets, while its manufacturing capabilities could produce technology that the galaxy had never seen, Commander. Yunbora asked about the fighters, and Arya showed her that the ship now carried advanced combat craft that could move faster and strike harder than any Coalition vessel while remaining virtually invisible to their detection systems engineer. Choi Min-ho discovered that the ship's power systems had been upgraded with technology that could provide virtually unlimited energy, while the manufacturing bays could produce new ships and equipment using raw materials harvested from asteroids. But the most important discovery came when Arya revealed that the Eternal Defiance was not alone, and that other human ships had also survived the Purge and were scattered throughout the galaxy, waiting for a signal to emerge from hiding. The AI had maintained contact with these other vessels through quantum communication networks that the Coalition could not detect, and there were at least 3 other supercarriers plus dozens of smaller ships with human crews still alive in deep sleep. Admiral Park Soo-jin realized that they now faced a choice that would determine the future of both humanity and the galaxy, because they could remain hidden and safe, or they could reveal themselves and risk everything to challenge the Coalition's control. Lee Dae-ho looked around at his awakening crew and saw the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through the darkest days of the Purge, when they had watched their homeworld burn and their people scattered across the stars. Dr. Kim Tae-woo began the process of awakening more crew members, while Commander Yunbora headed to the fighter bays to assess their readiness for combat, and Engineer Choi Min-ho started bringing all ship systems to full operational status. The Eternal Defiance was no longer just a refuge for the last survivors of humanity, but had become something more powerful and dangerous than anything the Coalition had faced in their 2 centuries of unchallenged rule. As the ship's systems came fully online, Lee Dae-ho felt the deck vibrate beneath his feet with the power of technologies that had evolved far beyond what the galaxy thought possible, and he knew that the time for hiding was about to end. The Coalition mining ships continued their work in the outer system, completely unaware that they were being watched by eyes that burned with the memory of a dead homeworld and the determination to ensure that such a crime would never happen again. Major Han Ji-woo led the first reconnaissance team through the darkened corridors of Coalition Mining Station Delta 7 and moved like a shadow through spaces that had been carved from the asteroid that once orbited Earth. The stealth suits that Arya had developed during the long sleep made them invisible to Coalition sensors and allowed them to walk among alien workers who had no idea that the extinct humans were studying their every move. Lieutenant Nam So-young crouched beside a communication console and connected her neural interface to the Coalition network, while her teammates provided cover, and within minutes she had access to data streams that revealed the true scope of Coalition operations in human space. The mining stations were just the beginning. because coalition forces had spent 2 centuries systematically stripping every human world of its resources while erasing all evidence that humans had ever existed in these systems. Han Ji-woo watched through his helmet display as coalition overseers directed slave workers from a dozen different species to process materials that had once been part of human cities, and the casual cruelty of their methods made his jaw clench with anger. The coalition had turned resource extraction into a science of oppression where every worker was expendable and every world was treated as nothing more than raw materials waiting to be harvested. Nam So-young's neural link brought her deeper into the coalition communication network, and she began to understand the scope of their control over the galaxy while listening to reports from thousands of star systems where similar operations were taking place. Back on the Eternal Defiance, Dr. Shin Hyun-woo studied the weapon systems that had evolved during their sleep and discovered that human technology had advanced far beyond anything the coalition possessed. The ship's primary cannons could now fire quantum disruption beams that would tear apart coalition vessels at the molecular level, while the secondary batteries could launch swarms of intelligent missiles that would adapt their approach to overcome any defensive system. Captain Oh Yoo-jin prepared her stealth operations teams for deeper penetration into coalition space and studied star charts that showed the locations of major coalition military bases and administrative centers. The coalition had grown fat and lazy during their 2 centuries of unchallenged rule, and their security protocols were designed to detect known threats rather than technologies they believed no longer existed. Admiral Park Soo-jin reviewed intelligence reports from the reconnaissance teams and began to understand that the coalition was not the advanced civilization they claimed to be, but was instead a parasitic system that consumed other cultures while contributing nothing of value. The coalition member species had been reduced to specialized roles that served the central authority, and none of them retained the innovative capacity or independent thinking that had once made them great. Dr. Kim Tae-woo analyzed biological samples that the reconnaissance teams had collected and found that coalition genetic engineering had actually weakened their member species by removing the aggressive and competitive traits that drove technological advancement. The coalition had literally bred the fight out of their subjects and created a galaxy of compliant workers who would never challenge authority or question the established order. Commander Yoon Bo-ra took her first patrol of fighters beyond the asteroid field and tested their capabilities against simulated coalition targets while maintaining stealth protocols that kept them invisible to enemy sensors. The fighters responded to her commands with precision that exceeded anything she had experienced before the long sleep, and their weapon systems could destroy coalition ships with single shots while remaining undetected. Engineer Choi Min-ho began manufacturing additional equipment and supplies using raw materials from the asteroid field, and the automated systems produced technology that was centuries ahead of current coalition capabilities. The manufacturing bays could create new fighters and support craft within hours, while the research laboratories continued to develop even more advanced systems using principles that the coalition could not understand. ARIA coordinated all these activities while monitoring coalition communications across hundreds of star systems and began to identify targets that would send a message to the galaxy without causing unnecessary civilian casualties. The AI had developed a strategic plan that would reveal humanity's survival while demonstrating their technological superiority and the futility of coalition resistance. Han Ji-woo's reconnaissance teams penetrated deeper into coalition space and discovered that many of the species that served the coalition were actually prisoners who had been conquered and enslaved just as the coalition had attempted to do to humanity. The coalition maintained control through a combination of technological dependence and systematic oppression that kept member species from developing their own capabilities or questioning their subservient roles. Nam So-young accessed coalition historical records and found evidence that the purge of humanity had been motivated by fear rather than any genuine threat, because human innovation and independence had begun, to inspire other species to question coalition authority. The coalition leadership had recognized that human culture represented an existential threat to their system of control, and had decided that genocide was preferable to allowing human ideas to spread throughout the galaxy. Dr. Shin Hyun-woo completed his analysis of coalition military capabilities and reported to Admiral Park Soo-jin that their weapons and defensive systems were decades behind current human technology and would be unable to resist even a limited attack. The coalition military relied on overwhelming numbers and the psychological impact of their reputation rather than actual combat effectiveness, and had not fought a serious opponent in over a century. Captain Oh Yoo-jin's stealth teams began placing monitoring devices throughout coalition space that would allow area to track their movements and communications while remaining completely undetected. The monitoring network revealed that coalition forces were spread thin across their vast territory and relied heavily on automated systems that could be disrupted or controlled by superior technology. Admiral Park Soo-jin called a meeting of all senior officers and presented them with intelligence that painted a clear picture of coalition weakness and the opportunity that lay before them. The coalition was a hollow empire that maintained power through fear and deception rather than actual strength, and their member species were waiting for someone to show them that resistance was possible. Lee Dae-ho listened to the briefings and felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders because they could no longer remain hidden while watching the coalition continue to exploit and oppress the galaxy. Reconnaissance data showed coalition supply convoys moving through space with minimal protection while carrying resources stolen from conquered worlds to feed the appetite of the Central Authority. Commander Yoon Bo-ra suggested that they could begin with small strikes against these supply convoys to test coalition responses while demonstrating that their control was not absolute. Dr. Kim Tae-woo proposed that they could use their advanced technology to disable coalition systems without causing casualties and show oppressed species that their masters were not as powerful as they appeared. Engineer Choi Min-ho pointed out that the manufacturing capabilities of the Eternal Defiance could support extended operations while producing new equipment and weapons as needed. Area calculated the probability of success for various strategic approaches and recommended a campaign of escalating strikes that would force the coalition to reveal their true capabilities while inspiring resistance. Among oppressed species, Admiral Park Soo-jin studied the faces of her officers and saw the same determination that had carried them through the darkest days of the Purge when they had watched their civilization burn. The decision was made without formal vote or discussion because they all understood that hiding in the asteroid field while the coalition continued its crimes would be a betrayal of everything humanity had stood for. Lee Dae-ho felt the ship around him respond to their collective will as systems that had been dormant for centuries came fully online and prepared for operations that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The Eternal Defiance began to move through the asteroid field like a predator awakening, from long sleep and preparing to hunt prey that had grown comfortable in the absence of natural enemies. Coalition Sector Command Station Omega-7 hung in space like a metal mountain, and its massive bulk contained the command centers that coordinated military operations across 12 star systems while housing over 500,000 Coalition personnel. Admiral Vextar reviewed the reports of mysterious attacks on supply convoys with growing irritation because the unknown attackers struck without warning and disappeared before coalition forces could respond or even identify their vessels. The attacks had begun 3 months earlier with the complete destruction of a mining convoy in the former human system and had escalated to include strikes on military supply lines and communication relays throughout the sector coalition. Investigators had found no trace of the attacking force except for weapon signatures that matched no known technology in their databases and tactical patterns that seemed to anticipate their responses before they were made. Colonel Jang Woo-jin studied the holographic display that showed the massive command station rotating slowly against the backdrop of distant stars, while his assault teams prepared for an operation that would have been impossible for any known military force. The Eternal Defiance drifted silently through space using stealth technology that made it invisible to Coalition sensors, while its manufacturing bays worked constantly to produce the specialized equipment needed for the assault Dr. Moon. Jin had spent weeks developing weapons that could penetrate Coalition defensive systems without causing unnecessary casualties because the human command staff had decided that terror tactics would only validate Coalition propaganda about human savagery. Commander Bai Jun Seo coordinated the complex timing that would allow multiple assault teams to strike simultaneously at different sections of the command station while maintaining tactical surprise. Lieutenant Colonel Quan Mi Ran had infiltrated Coalition intelligence networks and identified the locations of critical command centers and the personal quarters of senior officers who would need to be captured to ensure the operation's success. Admiral Vextar felt confident that his station's defenses could repel any attack, because the weapons platforms that surrounded Omega-7 could destroy entire fleets, while the shield generators provided protection that had never been breached. The Coalition had built their command stations to be impregnable fortresses that could coordinate military operations even while under siege, and the thought that any force could capture such a facility was simply beyond consideration. Lee Dae-ho stood in the command center of the Eternal Defiance and watched as his officers made final preparations for an assault that would announce humanity's return to the galaxy in terms that could not be ignored or dismissed. The plan was complex and dangerous because they would need to disable the station's defenses while avoiding civilian casualties and capturing key personnel who could provide intelligence about Coalition operations. Commander Yoon Bo-ra led the first wave of fighters toward the command station, and her pilots flew in formations that confused Coalition sensors because they moved in patterns that seemed random but were actually precisely coordinated. The Coalition defense platforms began firing at targets they could barely detect, while the human fighters used superior speed and maneuverability. To avoid the incoming fire and approach their assigned targets, Dr. Shin Hyun-woo triggered the quantum disruption weapons that Area had developed, and the Coalition shield generators flickered and died as their power systems were overloaded by energy, patterns they could not resist. Colonel Jang Woo-jin launched his assault shuttles toward the disabled command station, while Coalition fighters scrambled to intercept them, but found themselves facing opponents whose capabilities exceeded their understanding. The human assault teams moved through the station's corridors with precision that came from months of planning and intelligence gathering, while their advanced weapons disabled Coalition security systems and personnel with minimal lethal force. Admiral Vextar watched in shock as his impregnable fortress was penetrated by forces that seemed to anticipate every defensive measure and counter every tactical response before it could be implemented. The Coalition soldiers who tried to resist the human assault found themselves facing opponents who moved faster and fought smarter than anyone they had encountered while using weapons that could disable their equipment without harming them personally. Commander Bai Jun Seo coordinated the capture of key command centers while his team secured critical intelligence data and communication systems that would reveal the full scope of Coalition operations. Lieutenant Colonel Quan Mi Ran led the team that captured Admiral Vextar, and his senior staff and the Coalition officers surrendered when they realized that resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties among their personnel. The entire assault took less than 6 hours from start to finish, and when it was over, the humans controlled the most important military command center in the sector, while Coalition forces throughout the region struggled to understand what had happened. Dr. Moon Hye-jin began analyzing the intelligence data they had captured and found evidence of Coalition operations that revealed the true scope of their oppression and exploitation throughout the galaxy. The command center's databases contained detailed records of slave labor operations and resource extraction programs that had devastated hundreds of worlds, while enriching the coalition leadership. Admiral Park Soo-jin reviewed the captured communications and discovered that coalition military forces were spread far too thin to respond effectively to coordinated attacks, while their command structure was rigid and inflexible. The coalition had become dependent on their reputation for invincibility and had never developed the tactical flexibility needed to respond to opponents who could match their technology and exceed their strategic thinking. Engineer Choi Min-ho supervised the installation of human technology throughout the captured station, and within hours the facility was operating under Arya's control while appearing normal to outside observers. The AI began using the station's communication systems to monitor coalition responses to the attack while simultaneously broadcasting carefully crafted messages to oppressed species throughout the region. Lee Dae-ho addressed the captured coalition personnel and explained that humanity had returned not as conquerors, but as liberators who would end the system of oppression that had dominated the galaxy for too long. Admiral Vextar listened with growing horror as the human captain described technologies and capabilities that exceeded anything in coalition databases, while offering evidence of human survival that contradicted everything he had been taught. The coalition had built their power on the assumption that no species could challenge. Their authority and the sudden appearance of technologically superior humans shattered the foundation of their control. Dr. Kim Tae-woo analyzed the biological data from coalition personnel and confirmed that centuries of genetic manipulation had, indeed, weakened their capacity for independent thinking and aggressive action. The coalition species were no longer capable of the kind of innovative thinking and determined resistance that had characterized their ancestors before they were absorbed into the Galactic Empire. Commander Yoon Bo-ra established fighter patrols around the captured station, and her pilots reported that coalition response forces were approaching but seemed confused and disorganized in their tactical approach. The coalition military had not faced serious opposition in over a century, and their officers lacked the experience and training needed to fight opponents who could challenge their technological superiority. Captain Oh Yoo-jin used the station's intelligence networks to coordinate with resistance movements throughout coalition space and found that oppressed species were already beginning to organize in response to news of the human attack. The assault on Omega-7 had demonstrated that coalition power could be challenged and defeated, which gave hope to billions of beings who had lived under oppression for generations. Arya calculated the strategic impact of their success and reported that coalition confidence was beginning to crack as their member species questioned the invincibility of their masters. The capture of Sector Command Station. Omega-7 would force the coalition to respond with overwhelming force or risk losing control of the entire region as resistance movements gained strength. Admiral Park Soo-jin studied the tactical situation and realized that they had achieved more than a military victory because they had broken the psychological foundation of coalition power. The galaxy was about to learn that the extinct humans had returned, with capabilities that exceeded anything the coalition possessed and a determination to end the oppression that had dominated galactic civilization for too long. Lee Dae-ho felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized that their actions had committed humanity to a conflict that would determine the future of every species in the galaxy. Coalition Supreme Commander Zephron stood before the assembled fleet lords and felt rage burning in his chest as he reviewed the reports of human attacks throughout the galactic territories. The capture of Sector Command Station Omega-7 had sent shockwaves through coalition space and inspired rebellion on dozens of worlds where oppressed species had begun to believe that their masters could be defeated. Zephron had spent his entire career maintaining coalition dominance through fear and overwhelming force, but now faced an enemy that seemed immune to intimidation and superior in every aspect of warfare. The fleet assembling in coalition prime space was the largest military force in galactic history with over 10,000 ships. drawn from every corner of the empire, while their crews prepared for a battle that would determine the future of civilization. Vice Admiral Lim Dong-hyun reviewed the tactical displays aboard the Eternal Defiance and felt a mixture of pride and concern as he watched coalition forces massing for an assault that would test every system and capability they possessed. The other human ships had emerged from their hiding places throughout the galaxy and were moving toward the rendezvous coordinates, while their crews awakened from centuries of sleep to face the greatest challenge in human history. The Resolute Dawn, commanded by Admiral Cho Jun-ho, had spent 200 years hidden in the nebula clouds of the Vega system while developing weapons and defensive systems that exceeded even those of the Eternal Defiance. Captain Song Yoonbi led her fighter squadron through practice maneuvers between the assembling human ships and marveled at the coordination they achieved despite having been separated for so long. The Phoenix Rising under Admiral Yang Su-bin had concealed itself in the asteroid belt of an unnamed system, while its automated research programs developed manufacturing technologies that could produce entire fleets from raw materials. Major Lee Sang-ho prepared his Marine boarding teams for combat operations that would involve fighting their way through coalition ships whose crews had never faced opponents capable of matching their technology. The Iron Will, commanded by Admiral Kim Tae-sung, had hidden near the Galactic Rim while its crew studied coalition tactics and developed countermeasures for every weapon system and defensive protocol in their arsenal. Dr. Yu Jin-ah established medical facilities throughout the human fleet, because the coming battle would test their casualties, treatment capabilities, while they faced odds that would have been impossible for any other force. Coalition intelligence services worked frantically to understand how humans had survived the purge and developed technologies that surpassed their own while remaining completely undetected for 2 centuries. The reports they compiled painted a picture of human capabilities that challenged everything the coalition believed. About technological development and military organization, Admiral Park Soo-jin studied the approaching coalition fleet through sensors that could detect and analyze their ships from distances that exceeded coalition detection ranges by several orders of magnitude. The enemy force was massive and impressive, but their tactical formations revealed the same rigid thinking that had allowed humans to capture Omega-7 without significant casualties. Lee Dae-ho walked through the corridors of his ship and felt the vibration of systems operating at peak efficiency while 50,000 crew members prepared for a battle that would either establish human independence or result in their final extinction. The human fleet consisted of only 4 supercarriers and their escorts, but each ship possessed capabilities that exceeded anything the coalition had developed during their centuries of unchallenged dominance. Commander Yoon Bo-ra reviewed fighter deployment plans with her squadron leaders and felt confidence building as she studied weapons systems that could destroy coalition ships with single shots while remaining invisible to their sensors. The coalition approach was predictable because their military doctrine relied on overwhelming numbers and brute force, rather than the tactical innovation that humans had developed during their long exile. Area-coordinated communications between the human ships and calculated optimal engagement patterns while simultaneously monitoring coalition command frequencies to track their decision-making processes. The AI had evolved far beyond its original programming during the centuries of isolation and now possessed strategic capabilities that exceeded those of any coalition. Command System Coalition. Supreme Commander Zephron led his fleet toward the coordinates where human ships had been detected, and felt certain that numerical superiority would overcome whatever advantages the extinct species might possess. His 10,000 ships represented the combined military might of dozens of species and carried weapons that had never failed to achieve victory against any opponent they had faced. The coalition formation was massive and intimidating as it moved through space with the confidence of forces that had never experienced defeat and expected their reputation alone to intimidate any opposition. Vice Admiral Lim Dong-hyun watched the enemy approach and coordinated defensive positions with the other human Ships, while their advanced sensors provided detailed intelligence about coalition capabilities and intentions. The enemy ships were individually powerful, but their tactical coordination was poor, and their command structure was too rigid to adapt. Quickly to changing battlefield conditions, Captain Song Yeon-bi launched her fighters as the first coalition vessels came within engagement range, and led her squadron in attacks that confused enemy sensors with speed and maneuverability they could not match. The coalition fighters that tried to intercept them found themselves outclassed by opponents who moved faster and fought smarter while using weapons that could disable their ships without destroying them. Major Lee Sang-ho led his Marines in boarding actions against coalition command ships, and his teams moved through enemy vessels with precision that came from superior training and advanced equipment. The coalition crews they encountered had been weakened by centuries of genetic manipulation and lacked the aggressive instincts needed to resist opponents who fought with human determination. Dr. Yu Jinna worked frantically to treat casualties as the battle intensified and found that human losses were surprisingly light. While coalition forces suffered devastating damage from weapons they could not understand or counter. The Phoenix Rising and Iron Will attacked the coalition flanks, while the Resolute Dawn and Eternal Defiance held the center and their coordinated assault shattered enemy formations that had seemed invincible. Admiral Yang Su-bin used her ship's advanced manufacturing capabilities to produce replacement fighters and missiles during the battle, while her automated systems repaired damage faster than coalition weapons could inflict. Coalition Supreme Commander Zephyron watched his massive fleet being systematically destroyed by only 4 human ships and felt his confidence crumbling as reports of impossible human capabilities reached his command center. The humans were not just surviving his assault, but were actually winning, despite being outnumbered by more than 20 to 1 while demonstrating technologies that exceeded his understanding. Admiral Park Soo-jin coordinated the human response with tactical precision that kept coalition forces off balance while maximizing the effectiveness of every weapon system and defensive measure. The battle became a demonstration of human superiority in every aspect of warfare, from individual combat skills to strategic coordination, while coalition forces struggled to adapt to opponents who anticipated their every move. Lee Dae-ho felt the Eternal Defiance shudder under enemy fire, but watched as the ship's defensive systems absorbed damage that would have destroyed any coalition vessel, while his weapons carved through enemy formations. The coalition fleet was dissolving under human attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once, while their rigid command structure prevented them from coordinating an effective response. Commander Yoon Bo-ra led her fighters deep into coalition formations and destroyed command ships with surgical precision, while avoiding civilian transports and support vessels that posed no military threat. The battle raged for 18 hours before coalition forces began to withdraw, and Supreme Commander Zephyron realized that his greatest fleet had been defeated by an enemy he had dismissed as extinct primitives. The human victory was complete and devastating as coalition ships fled in disorder while leaving behind wreckage that testified to the superiority of human technology and tactical thinking. The Great Assembly Hall on Kepler Station buzzed with the voices of representatives from over 300 species as they gathered for the first Galactic Liberation Council meeting in the 2 years since coalition rule had collapsed. Captain Lee Dae-ho walked through corridors that had once housed coalition administrators and felt satisfaction at seeing free beings moving with dignity instead of the fearful submission that had characterized coalition space for centuries. Fleet Admiral Park Soo-jin reviewed reports from across the galaxy where former coalition territories were establishing democratic governments, while human ships provided security and technical assistance to ensure smooth transitions. The dissolution of coalition power had happened faster than anyone expected, as member species abandoned their oppressors once they realized that effective resistance was possible and that humans would support their independence. General Kim Tae-sung coordinated liberation operations on worlds where coalition loyalists still maintained control, and his forces worked carefully to minimize casualties while ensuring that no species would be forced back into slavery. Ambassador Lee Hae-young moved between different species, delegations, and used her diplomatic skills to mediate disputes while helping former enemies learn to work together as equals in the new galactic order. The coalition remnants had retreated to their core worlds where they maintained control through increasingly desperate measures while their former subjects celebrated freedom they had never expected to experience. Admiral Cho Jun-ho commanded patrol fleets that protected liberated worlds from coalition retaliation attempts, while his ships demonstrated that human protection was reliable and came without the price of submission. Director Yang Soo-bin managed the massive logistical effort of providing humanitarian aid to worlds that had been devastated by centuries of coalition exploitation, while rebuilding infrastructure that had been deliberately neglected. The human fleet had grown from 4 supercarriers to dozens of ships, as automated manufacturing systems produced vessels designed to protect rather than conquer while training. Crews from liberated species to operate them. Dr. Kim Tae-woo worked with scientists from hundreds of species to develop medical treatments that could reverse some of the genetic damage caused by coalition manipulation programs that had weakened entire populations. The research facilities aboard human ships had become centers of innovation where different species contributed their unique perspectives to solve problems that had seemed impossible under Coalition Rule Commander Yoon Bo-ra. Trained pilots from former Coalition species and found that once freed from genetic restrictions, many of them possessed natural abilities that exceeded those of their former masters. The fighter squadrons now included representatives from dozens of worlds who flew alongside human pilots in formations that symbolized the cooperation that was replacing coalition oppression. Engineer Choi Min-ho supervised the construction of new space stations and shipyards throughout liberated space, while teaching advanced manufacturing techniques to species that had been deliberately kept in technological dependence. Major Han Ji-woo led peacekeeping forces that helped maintain order during the transition period while ensuring that liberation did not become an excuse for revenge against former coalition collaborators. The human approach to justice emphasized rehabilitation and reconstruction rather than punishment because they understood that many coalition supporters had been victims of systematic indoctrination rather than willing oppressors. Lieutenant Nam So-young coordinated communication networks that connected liberated worlds and allowed former subjects to share information and coordinate their development without interference. From outside authorities, Dr. Shin Hyun-woo worked with defense specialists from different species to develop weapons systems that could protect the new galactic order while ensuring that no single species could dominate others through military superiority. Captain Oh Yoo-jin established intelligence services that monitored coalition remnants and other potential threats while respecting the privacy and autonomy of liberated species who had suffered too long under surveillance. The Galactic Liberation Alliance had emerged from the chaos following coalition collapse and represented a new model of interspecies cooperation based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical domination. Lieutenant Colonel Kwon Mi-ran analyzed social and political developments throughout liberated space and reported that democratic institutions were taking root even among species that had never experienced self-governance. The transformation was not without challenges because centuries of oppression had left many species unprepared for the responsibilities of freedom, while others struggled with internal conflicts that coalition rule had suppressed. Dr. Moon Hye-jin developed educational programs that helped liberated populations understand their rights and responsibilities while learning the skills needed to participate in democratic governance. Admiral Yang Soo-bin established trade networks that allowed different species to exchange goods and services on equal terms rather than the exploitative relationships that had characterized coalition commerce. The economic transformation was as dramatic as the political changes because liberated species discovered that cooperation produced better results than the competition and exploitation that coalition ideology had promoted. Commander Bae Jun-seo coordinated humanitarian missions that delivered food and medical supplies to worlds where coalition withdrawal had left populations in desperate need of assistance. The human response to these crises demonstrated that their power would be used to help rather than exploit and convinced remaining skeptics that the new order represented genuine improvement over coalition rule area had evolved into a galaxy-spanning intelligence, network that coordinated relief efforts and provided information to democratic governments while respecting their autonomy and decision-making authority. The AI systems developed by humans during their exile had become tools for liberation rather than control, and helped ensure that no species would ever again face the systematic oppression that had characterized coalition rule. Lee Dae-ho stood before the assembled representatives in the Great Hall and felt the weight of history as he prepared to address beings whose ancestors had suffered under coalition tyranny for generations. His speech would mark the formal establishment of the Galactic Liberation Alliance and set the principles that would guide interspecies relations for centuries to come. The hall fell silent as he began to speak, and his words carried the authority of someone who had led humanity through its darkest hour and emerged victorious against impossible odds. He spoke of the lessons learned during humanity's exile, and the determination to ensure that no species would ever again face extinction at the hands of those who claimed to represent civilization. The principles he outlined emphasized individual dignity and species autonomy while establishing mechanisms for collective defense against any future threats to galactic freedom. Admiral Park Soo-jin watched from the observation deck as representatives from hundreds of worlds voted unanimously to establish the alliance and felt pride in what humanity had accomplished. The galaxy that emerged from coalition collapse was not perfect, but it was free, and that freedom had been purchased with human determination and sacrifice that would never be forgotten. The Eternal Defiance hung in orbit above Kepler Station and served as a symbol of the price of freedom, while its weapons remained ready to defend the liberty that so many had died to achieve. Children from dozens of species played together in the station's parks, while their parents worked to build a future where such cooperation would be normal rather than miraculous. The human fleet patrolled the borders of Alliance space and protected the growing civilization that had replaced coalition oppression with hope and opportunity for all. Species Lee Dae-ho looked out at the stars and knew that humanity had found its purpose not as conquerors, but as guardians of freedom, who would ensure that the galaxy remained a place where all beings could pursue their own destiny. The Alliance would face challenges and threats in the years to come, but it would do so with the knowledge that courage and determination could overcome any oppression, and that freedom was worth any sacrifice necessary to preserve it.